Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. So I will be talking about efficient ISO IDMP implementation in different profiles of pharma companies. And this will be based on our practical experience and the frequently asked questions that we received. So as a summary of what we will be looking at today is an ISO IDMP and its generalities and the impact it has on industry, as well as discussing how this impact affects the small, the medium, the large portfolio, and discussing as well a little bit on how the transition to ISO IDMP is and what complexity it brings depending on different RIM scenarios. So if we start with ISO IDMP and the impacts on the industry, the first question is, how is ISO IDMP implementation looking like at the moment? So the implementation of the 5 ISO IDMP standards have been in the radar for some time now, and there is still uncertainty not only in the timelines, but also in the overall process. So industry is now more than ever seeking for support to start preparing for the transition that it seems now to be around the corner. But so far with SPOR, we know that it's being used for referentials and is being used for organizations, so OMS and RMS. They are already fully working as the expected validated database, where you can view, search, export, update, and reuse data. So even though there are still lists to be created in RMS or information that needs to be corrected in OMS, they are already up and running. For SMS, we can say similar things. So SMS is live for MIUs. It is being constructed as the different substance type are being assessed and cleaned, including those that are newly submitted. The process for registering new substance have been already established and shared. And if we look at PMS, then we know that it's already moving forward. And currently there is the migration test from XBMPD, including the plan user acceptance testings in order to support the go live of DADI. So we know that this migration is on the way as well. The biggest question at the moment is what does industry needs to do to be ready for both the use of DADI and the implementation of PMS. So understanding the timelines and managing the expectations for DADI and for PMS is the first step for the transition into ISO IDMP. So this often shared calendar for the implementation of PMS brings uncertainty for the stakeholders, but the confirmation that DADI is going live this October is setting already the expectations for everyone to move forward. So with this first release, as DADI is going live in October, we know that it will be feeding from data in PMS, and this data is migrated prior to its go live. However, we know that this data may not be complete and may not be correct. The latest news, though, define that there are 2 releases. So the first release that would be replacing the electronic application form that we currently use and already feeds from data from SPOR. But with the second release, there is a plan to have an ingester in place, and this ingester is in order to feed data back to PMS. And this is what in part will allow to start the cleaning and the enrichment of PMS data, which will happen more or less at the same time that the second release of DADI goes live. The enrichment of the PMS data would be covered in the Chapter 9 of the implementation guideline with the version 3.0, but the time for its release is still unclear. And the dates for the ISO IDMP implementation calendar are still to be confirmed. So just as it happened with other projects like for ECTD, the timelines have changed, and we have to wait for news from EMA to understand how this will be implemented. What we know and what we're waiting for is this Q&A document that EMA say they will publish in PMS, and of course the future workshops that they have already offered before. The timelines for the rest of DADI web forms are still unclear, and when the XBMPD will be decommissioned as well remains unclear. What is clear for everyone is that the transition into ISO IDMP is complex, and the preparation for it will be definitely a challenge for everyone. So there are many different scenarios for industry when planning for ISO IDMP compliance, and it is important to find efficiency for each profile of company. It is not only the awareness process and diving into the timelines and the processes and the requirements for ISO IDMP, but also to navigate of the current scenario of the company. So what is the budget, what is the portfolio, what is the approach the company will take for the transition. And the approach can be as little as the minimal effort to be compliant, or as big as to involve a full digitalization of the company involving different organizations and teams. So as key steps, of course, considering the specific circumstances of the company is really important. And what is applicable for everyone is the knowledge of the process, defining the applicability of the requirements for ISO IDMP, having a data quality assessment of sport, taking a step on digitalization, and defining the approach for compliance. So the three big key steps will be the focusing on the data, the requirements versus the data that the company has internally, focusing on the submission processes for the implementation of ISO IDMP, but also the internal processes of the company and how they will be transformed to maintain compliance, and the technology. What will be the approach that will allow the ensuring the compliance with ISO IDMP? So how could these current changes influence the industry decision? So if we focus on authorized medicinal products, as we saw before, the first dive into ISO IDMP will be with the go live of DADI this October. We know that DADI will be feeding from PMS, and we know that the conditions are already that there wouldn't be at the first release submissions allowed or enrichment and corrections allowed for PMS. And we know that with the first release, there wouldn't be any feedback loop either. So mostly the data in PMS at the first release of DADI will be all the data that is migrated from XBMPD and CMN, either one-to-one migration or a rule-based migration, which just means a transformation of the data. But this leaves out that there are some product selection fields in DADI that will require that this data in PMS to be clean in the future. So for now, we know that the submissions to XBMPD are still needed to maintain compliance with Article 57. We need to ensure that the data that we have in XBMPD is complete and correct, because this will be what we are seeing in DADI as it's feeding from PMS. We need to be aware of that data when we're using DADI. And of course, we need to define a strategy for cleaning and enrichment and enrich the PMS data, especially for those product selection fields from which DADI will be feeding. And we have to wait for information on the subsequent steps from the EMA. So if we look a little bit further at this from a process perspective, and we take into account that DADI goes live for variations only, so we can look at this overview. So how will the regulatory process be when DADI goes live? So if we look at the industry, when it starts preparing the submission package, we know that they will be using a DADI web form for that variation that will be feeding from data from PMS that we saw already that has data coming from XBMPD and CMN. So the industry will prepare this submission, will compile the ECTD sequence and including the DADI web form, and do the submission. So the competent authority will go through their usual steps until the decision. And then we have to remember that the industry will still have to submit this XBMPD message to the EMA to be compliant. If we look at how the impact and what opportunities there are, we can see that the industry has now visibility of the data that is available on the regulator side that we didn't have before. We know that the team working with that is supporting the collection and the use of the master data in PMS. We know that the competent authorities have now opportunities to use this master data and promote automation. And of course, a big impact is that industry has now added complexity during the transition. So how is this impacting the different stakeholders? So even though industry has accepted the challenge and the interest is increasing to be ready for ISO IDMP, there's still a lot of uncertainty on the impact and the regulatory impact, not only for the overall processes, but also internally on how the companies will manage the transitions. There is still uncertainty on these internal processes, and the industry must make an effort to look further from the timelines and commit to digitalization. Data governance is key for a sustainable transition into ISO IDMP. And of course, the roles of responsibility and those tools that were offered from the beginning and its availability we still need clarification on those. And industry still need clarification on this to understand how they can move forward in the best way. And lastly, what I commented already before, this transitional complexity of having multiple processes and systems as one that are interconnected. So it seems that the impact could be tied to the size of the company portfolio as well as to the maturity of it. So we can see a little bit more what ISO IDMP means for the different types of portfolio companies. So we can look at the small, the medium, and the large portfolio. But to start with, what is common for all of these portfolio sizes? So no matter the size, everyone more or less has the same data points to collect. So these are some summaries from the implementation guideline from different chapters, where we have the conformance of the different data fields for the different categories. We have an extract of the different type of data, so those fields that are created with the migration or the go live of PMS, for which there are no actions, as these are created at that moment and are usually IDs or data fields like the domain, that in this case will be human, as only the human data will be migrated. There are those fields that are require an action post-migration. So the action will be the cleaning and the enrichment. So these are all the data fields that will be migrated from XBMPD and CMED into PMS, either from this one-to-one or rule-based migration that we saw before. And then those fields that are, even though they are in XBMPD, they cannot be migrated. And those that have to be looked in other sources, whether are databases, RIM systems already in the company, or actual free text within a document where we have to go and extract the data. So the priority for many is now focusing on this data that is migrated, whereas the priority before was to prepare all this data for the go live of PMS. But now with DADI, we have seen that as data will be feeding from this data migrated to PMS, the importance of cleaning this data after the migration has become really important. So we can look a little bit more of what that means. So how does the transition period activities depend on the portfolio size, and how does this migration uh, goes to life? What do we have to do? So if we focus on this part, we know that the data from XVMPD and CMS will be migrated to PMS, and then it will be maintained with a live migration synchronization. We have seen that after the DABI will have its ingester, the process for the data cleansing and enrichment for PMS will most likely start. But until then, we also know that we still have to do the submission to XVMPD. And one important thing to have in mind is that when we have this submission to XVMPD, we have to keep an eye on the XVMPD data maintenance, especially now that we know that it will still stay around in the near future, or we don't have a clear date from where it will be decommissioned. So one important step is to look for the third acknowledgement to review the data. And this will be a review and an analysis of what data the EMA has, what data is in XVMPD, and what data do we have in our systems. If it's incorrect, then we have to create a ticket to EMA service text. But if we agree that the changes that the EMA has done are correct, then this data has to be updated in the RIM or in the database. So it is important to maintain an analysis of what is in XVMPD and what is in our internal RIM system, looking in the future on what data will be in PMS. If we focus now on the migration impact, we can see that we have the companies that have a larger centralized authorized procedure portfolio or a non-cap portfolio. So those that have a majority of non-caps, which tend to be those smaller, medium-sized companies, then they will have a harder time, as there will be more data to be corrected, more data to be enriched with the go live of PMS and the second release of DADI. If you look at this graph, this was published from the EMA, and basically the colors mean that the fields can be partially empty, data from CMS, data from XVMPD, and then a combination of both would be filling the different data fields in PMS. So there will be a combination of information in PMS that has to be corrected and enriched depending on the authorization procedure. Then the effort will be more or less. So looking now on the transition to ISO IDMP and the complexity of the different RIM scenarios, we can see how the portfolio size is influencing the key factors for the implementation of ISO IDMP in an efficient way. So we have the early stage and the small companies, the medium companies, and the large companies. And we have here the RIM systems, data governance, data enrichment, transition timelines due to process complexity. So these will be our key factors, and these will be our different portfolio sizes. So for the RIM system, the early stage and small companies usually have none in place, whereas the medium tend to have something or are already implementing one due to the upcoming ISO IDMP. For the large, they usually have one already or is also implementing one. If we focus on data governance, the early stage and the small companies have an easier way to establish and maintain the data governance plan. The medium somehow have a complexity depending on the portfolio and the internal processes. But for the large, this tends to be very complex with many involved internal stakeholders. The data enrichment, of course, then is related to the cap and non-cap type of portfolio. And of course, the bigger the portfolio, the bigger the effort to be put into it. Regarding the transition timelines due to the process complexities, then for the early stage and the small, it can be short with a well and efficient plan, but it also depends on the technology available for the company. If we look at the medium-sized portfolio, the data preparation for ISO IDMP can be complex, but it can be adapted to core. So you can do a RIM implementation along with the preparation for ISO IDMP. And for the large, you have an adaptation process and a change management that introduces extra difficulties because of the portfolio type, but also the employee numbers. So if we look a little bit more into a few cases, so for the early stage and a small portfolio scenario that are from 0 to less than 50 MAs, or have investigational medicinal products in different stages of clinical trial, but no MA yet, the main challenge is not having a defined strategy or processes that exist for ISO IDMP, and a low level of urgency given their status. So the question is whether they have a RIM or no RIM, or whether they decide to implement one or not. Always not implementing a risk. A RIM is at their own risk, and usually is a temporary decision. If the company has a database and they are implementing a RIM, then there are two cases. You can do a parallel implementation of a RIM and a transition to ISO IDMP, as I said before. Or you have an implementation of RIM, and then now you're starting a transition to the ISO IDMP requirements. Or you decide to go to the ISO IDMP transition only as a third case. There is no implementation, but there is a data enrichment in the current database, including the process improvements in preparation for a future RIM. So this is a case where there is no implementation yet at their own risk. Of course, there are considerations, so compliance timelines for the CAPs versus non-CAP regarding the implementation of ISO IDMP. Mostly they are focused on awareness to understand the transition implication and possibilities on technology, some with interest in process streamlining and data governance in order to be compliant in the future. If we look at the medium portfolio scenario, so let's say from 50 to 500 MAs, the main challenge is the high effort on data collection, cleaning, and enriching, especially if there is no RIM system available. So similarly, you can go from a database to a RIM, either with a parallel implementation and the transition at the same time, or an implementation of the RIM and then the transition to ISO IDMP. But then we have also two cases. So no implementation, but the data enrichment in the current database, as we saw before, in preparation for a future RIM, or a data enrichment in an already existing RIM, including the adaptation of the processes and the system improvements in order to be compliant for ISO IDMP. In general, the medium portfolio scenario or new portfolio companies are focusing on the transition requirements, how to implement a RIM system and prepare for the ISO IDMP at the same time. And there is a strong interest in the process streamlining and the data governance. And sometimes there is a need for process externalization more than in other cases. The large portfolio scenario, let's say more than 500 MAs. For example, one case with a parallel implementation of a RIM and transition to ISO IDMP. It could be done in 12 months with a full implementation and validation for a document management system, publishing and RIM system. This was over 1,000 registrations, 60 global products, over 90 locations. The main challenge, of course, was high effort on data collection, cleaning, and enriching. In general, this is true if there is no RIM system available prior to the implementation of a RIM. and the high effort to implement the process changes and the maintenance. So if we look at the different cases, we've seen as before the parallel implementation and the transition to ISO IDMP. The implementation of RIM would already enrich ISO IDMP data to some degree. This is from a RIM and possibly other databases into a single RIM. There is also cases from databases to RIM, as we saw before. So implementation and then transition, or the parallel implementation with the transition together. And also DMP transition only, so no implementation, but the data enrichment. If there is a RIM system, then the focus tends to be on the process and the system improvements in order to be compliant and maintain the data. And if no RIM system, then the focus tends to be on the parallel implementation and the preparation for ISO IDMP, while at the same time dealing with change management, which tend to be very complex. So, as a summary, to strive for improvement and accomplish compliance, then you should consider a RIM system. There is many benefits of implementing a RIM system, so ensuring compliance, having streamlined processes, defined data governance, having internal alignment, and a better interoperability within the company. And of course, you have to consider the company situation, the timeline, implementation steps and requirements. You have to consider the internal complexity, but also you have to define the present and future expectation, but always knowing that there is a vendor for every company and that there is different approach. So you can have the implementation done in-house, or you can work with an implementation partner. So as IDMP will be a process that will be growing within the time, then of course, considering a RIM is important, but also defining all the processes to maintain the data governance and adjust to the changes that will come in the future will be very important. So I see we are 1 minute left, so I just want to thank you all for being here. I saw in the chat that there seems that there is no questions. Alan, I think you're muted, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Lord. You're bang on time. That was a very comprehensive presentation, lots of details there. I've not seen any written question coming. I was interested in you mentioned that in a sense the next key date is going to be October of this year. Do you think that will be maintained? Is it likely to slip? Should people really continue planning as if that is, going to be the next major milestone?
Right. I mean, at the moment, it seems that that will be the date. But of course, the EMA has to go through all the migration and the user acceptance test. And we have to wait and see what happens with the user acceptance test. They have to go through bug fixing stuff too. So what I have heard is that if it delays, it wouldn't delay that much. So it still seems like it will be within this year. So yeah, we still should be preparing for it.
Best to plan for it. You mentioned that data governance is a key factor for the sustainable and successful transition into the IDMP and looking forward to further digitalization. Would you like to comment on that, or are there other factors that people really, what is the take-home message? What should people be focusing on in the next few months?
Right. So the data now is the key, right? And we know that data is created everywhere and transformed everywhere. This is why data governance is key. So you have to understand where the data is coming from, who is manipulating that data, and how that data needs to be at the end for you to be compliant. So this is why it's really important to understand all of this data transformation creation, where is it safe, but also to understand what the requirement is, so you are able to adapt the data and be compliant.
Very good. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I'm sure some of the participants were looking forward to the networking opportunities over the coming hour. But first of all, I'd like to thank you, Luz, for a very, very detailed and comprehensive presentation with lots of very useful information and suggestions, practical advice. And so you've been sharing your practical experience, and I hope it's helpful to the participants. And just to say that after the networking break, which will last from now till 1 o'clock, we'll be focusing our attention on other global markets, and including Latin America. And we'll be starting off with a session looking at pandemic readiness, very topical, and what lessons can be learned from the COVID-19 situation in ensuring regulatory agility. So that's at 1 o'clock. Look forward to seeing you back then, and have a good networking break, and maybe time for some sustenance. Thank you very much for all the
Thank you very
participants.
much.
Thank you to you especially, Lourdes, and all the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Same.
Bye.
Have a good day.